Welcome to another human read audiobook by the United Marxist Pact Discord server, linked below in the description. In this series, we continue our investigation into the initial construction, the organizational structure, and the principles and tactics of the form of worker organization capable of seizing political power and establishing the revolutionary proletarian dictatorship and communality, which can in turn produce the communism of production through the shared class interests of the workers of the entire world. Our goal is to compile, analyze, and elaborate on what all these texts have to say about this, and at the end have a strong understanding of the exact scientific process of this, particularly in general terms. At the end of our readings as a whole, we will try to put it all together and present it as a coherent whole in an educational video with associated notations. Today's reading will be the 1945 Party Platform. We have a pre-written textual analysis on the terms of the aforementioned topics, which is also posted in the pinned comment if you prefer to read it in text, or follow the link in the description to a read-only version of my Google Docs notes. This will summarize the contents of the text, but is no replacement for the actual reading itself for the sake of understanding the context. In addition, in the reading I supply my own commentary, critiques, additions, etc., which may be helpful for understanding some particularities. For our actual textual analysis, in this text, it is called for by the writer to take a variety of tactical actions that make the party distinct from revisionism, from revisionist and opportunist communist quote-unquote parties aligned with Moscow after World War II. It advises that fascism has not truly been defeated, but rather will take a new form after war, as the bourgeois nations cannot maintain their existence while the varying social groups within vie for power, thus weakening the ability to respond to working class movements. To this end, the vanguard party must respond with new propaganda, organization, and struggle, specifically to fight against the incorrect positions. The party must recognize the necessity of the party organization, reject social chauvinism and other opportunist elements, base its analysis on historical materialism, and recognize the development of capitalism into world imperialism. Due to the developments, the party must not fall for tricks which lead to the belief that the social groups outside of the proletariat can be collaborated with to defeat fascism, and be prepared to fight the highly developed bourgeois state, which is supported by all strata aligned together against the revolution, the ever greater ruthless concentration of capital, and the police state necessary to support all of this. Ultimately, our tactics ever and always need to be aimed at the political independence of the working class to prepare for, initiate, and carry out the final struggle. To that end, we must rebuild the international, this time in the correct, strict, disciplined manner. It must include all local and national movements which reject alignment with bourgeois organizations, engage in general anti-fascist struggle, reject social chauvinism, are anti-war, aim for the unity of the proletariat, fight bourgeois ideology through propaganda, and seek the organization of the international proletarian masses. This international must create a common program which rejects partial interests, instead creating general, safe, and organic force aiming for common struggle for world revolution. Within this international, the proletarian class parties must first develop their organizational framework under the direction of doctrine and program, seeking to bring in revolutionary militants that remain true communists, anti-fascist workers, socialist workers who denounce current worker organizations, and any petit bourgeois, artisan, or even bourgeois elements who are sympathetic, while also making it clear that those external elements must accept the program without hesitation. The structure itself must be dynamic, aiming principally at being in service to class tactics of political action, which defend against inadequate cadres and opportunist hierarchies. In addition, in order to rebuild the capacity of the parties to engage with the working class and start supporting economic struggle, the unions must be criticized and busted, replaced with genuine proletarian economic organizations which enter into direct conflict with their bosses and are part of an industrial general outfit. In terms of an irredentist or separatist movement, While these can help create objective revolutionary conditions, the party must seek maximal centralization, but be broken into partial interests, as local organs of struggle are unable to effectively fight against a modern, hyper organized bourgeois state. The party must be able to make its distinction from the reformists and social democrats and revisionists of other quote unquote communist parties. It must proclaim without hesitation the full content of its principles and goals, such as, but not limited to 1. The construction of a new proletarian economy that is rationally planned and weaves together and unites all productive activities without government compromise, bureaucracy, and privilege. 2. The intent for revolutionary insurrection against the ruling class, made clear through rejection of electoralism on the grounds of rejection of the bourgeois state and its minority principle. The understanding that constitutional majorities will not increase the class struggle, but going to the masses directly will, and making it clear that the party's program and propaganda is not harmed from corruption and disarmament of revolutionary energies caused by the influences of electoral activity. 3. The production of workers' councils that are representative organs of the proletarian class and act as organs of combat that aim for the destruction of all representative rights of the exploiting classes. 4. The full rejection of all social chauvinism, including that towards women, irredentism, nationalism, all false bourgeois stages internationalists caused by the bourgeoisie. 5. The official recognition of the character of religion as a political force, systematically excluding religious association from entrance into the party while clearly rejecting metaphysics and therefore religion. And that is the summary of this text. I will now begin the full audiobook reading. I hope that you enjoyed the session and will attend next time as well. Welcome to another reading session with you, 9 Marks Past Discord server. Today we are continuing our investigation into the construction, structure, principles, and tactics of the working class association, which can produce the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat, which can in turn produce communism. Today we are reading the Party Platform, written in 1945 for the International Communist Party. For anybody that's just coming in without being part of the server, please consider joining and going through our vetting process. The link is below. That stated, let's get started with the reading. The reconstruction of the working class party in Italy, capable of taking up the continuation of revolutionary politics in its international and national traditions, will only be able to constitute an event of actual historical content if the vanguard forces of the proletariat orient themselves quickly and decisively around a complete and coherent program of propaganda, organization, and struggle. The guidelines and cornerstones of such a program, perfectly in tune with the international needs of the movement and particularly applying to current situation of political struggle in Italy, are the following. 1. The theory of the party, which is to say, its own conception of the world and society, is that of Marxist scientific socialism, as it was restored against the revisionist tendencies with the reconstruction of a truly revolutionary international, which accompanied the victory of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. 2. The historical conception of the party is that of the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels from 1848 and of the historical materials conception of history of class struggle explained in it. Its economic theory is that of Marx's Capital, supplemented for the analysis of the most recent phase of capitalism by the fundamental assessment of Lenin's imperialism. Its programmatic policy is that developed consistently with the fundamental doctrine in Lenin's State and Revolution and the constitutive text of the Moscow International. 3. The party's historical evaluation of the main events of world history which occurred after the end of the First Imperial War and the establishment of the Third International rests on the following principles. A. Fascism is a world historic phenomena, an expression of the policy of the ruling bourgeois class in the phase in which capitalist economy assumes its monopolistic and imperialist characteristics. An essential characteristic of the fascist movement is the destructive offensive on the existence of independent working class movements and organizations. In this attack, fascism uses In addition to the forces of this new bourgeois party, it has created those of the state and of all the other bourgeois parties, which connive with it and in this counteroffensive task of preventative counter-revolution for the maintenance of class privileges. We reject as anti-historical thesis that fascism consists of a feudalistic or absolutist medieval reaction, aimed at destroying the social and political achievements of the industrial capitalist bourgeoisie. B. The Russian revolutionary regime, with the victory of October 1917, assumed a very clear proletarian character which historically surpassed the bourgeois content of the anti-Tsarist revolution of February and ruthlessly broke with all the lies of democratic liberalism and socialistite opportunism. I'm not going to say that word. It began inseparably and simultaneously the battle to bring about the violent overthrow of the states in the already fully developed capitalist countries and the transformation of the Russian social economy into communism. These two objectives could only be achieved in a simultaneous manner. Neither were achieved. The conservative forces of the bourgeois world, by defending and strengthening their power in the great developed countries, also sabotaged the construction of socialism in Russia. The Russian regime, after the first socialist achievements, has undergone a progressive but decisive involution. The economy has fallen back into a character of class privilege based on the exploitation of wage earners. In the social field, the wealthy classes have regained influence. In the legal field, bourgeois forms and norms have reappeared. In the internal political field, the revolutionary current that continued the Bolshevik traditions of the October Revolution and Leninism has been overwhelmed and dispersed, and lost control of the party and state. In the international sphere, the force of the Russian state became no longer an ally of all the exploited classes fighting on the ground of civil war for revolution in all countries, but a modern imperial state of colossal military force, collaborating in the game of alliances and wars with the various aggregations of bourgeois military state units at the service of historical needs that were no longer class-based, but national imperial. That is, according to a foreign policy dictated not by the interests of the international working class, but by those of a privileged national ruling state. This was written in 1945. I'm not too clear on which actions they're talking about, unless they're talking about, for example, Poland and the other connected struggles that tertiarily or directly involved a conflict against the Nazis. We might be talking about Finland too. I'm going to add this to our text on the dictatorship of the proletariat to talk about the character of a fallen dictatorship. Okay, continuing. Well, actually, let me just take these first two things, because this is useful in understanding some more principles, and these are what I would generally consider bases for Marxism. It says, hey, look, the theory of the party as the necessary organizational structure, the historical materialism, right? The development of capitalism along imperialist lines, and so on and so forth. So we're going to do a quick summarization. So the vanguard party must propagandize, organize, and struggle decisively on the grounds of combating revisionism and opportunism. This involves recognition and application of the basis for struggle being with the party organization, the rejection of social chauvinism and other opportunist elements of the Second International, basis of analysis being that of historical materialism, and the rejection of the development of capital internally into imperialism, or internationally into imperialism. Continuing, and we're skipping down. C. The Third International did not settle coherently with the powerful theoretical and programmatic framework in an equally revolutionary definitive way. The question of organization tactics. Due to the acceptance of too many opportunistic groups and strata, and due to a practice based on hastily and suddenly engaging in disoriented tactical maneuvers, the prerequisite of arriving as soon as possible to the general control of the working masses in order to lead them to revolution has been reversed into a relapse, into an opportunistic process, similar and more serious than that of the old international. The anti-proletarian development in the international situation and the internal Russian situation has brought this erroneous approach to tactical maneuvering back to the much more serious terrain of a progressive abandonment of revolutionary principles, programs, and politics. The present attitude of the Communist parties, which, after the official liquidation of the Third International, still follow Moscow, is one of open solidarity with the bourgeois regimes, of effective collaboration and social preservation, and makes them the obvious instruments of social and political mobilization of the working class at the service of the established order of property and capital. 4. The central political word of the International Communist Party in all countries, as during the war and during the apparent struggle in the bourgeois regimes that call themselves democratic against the fascist forms of capitalist government, as well as during the current post-war period in which the victorious states will inherit and adopt the same fascist policies after a more or less abrupt and more or less skillful conversion through propaganda. Ain't that the truth? Will not be to wait, to advocate, and to agitate towards a reconstitution of the bourgeois order typical of the outdated period of transitory liberal and democratic equilibrium. Thus, the party rejects any policy of collaboration with groups of bourgeois and pseudo-proletarian parties that advocate the false and deceptive postulate of replacing fascism with regimes of quote-unquote true democracy. Such a policy, first of all, is illusory because the capitalist world will not be able to order itself in liberal forms for as long as it survives, but will be increasingly hinged on monstrous state units, ruthless expression of the economic concentration of capitalism, and armed with an increasingly repressive police for the defense of their class interests. That is absolutely the case. The America, for instance, is pure police state. Continuing. Second of all, it is defeatist because in order to achieve this hypothesis, even if just for a while longer in some secondary sector of the modern world, if it could somehow survive, it sacrifices the much more important vital characteristics of the Marxist movement, namely, the political independence of the working class, which provide the only tactics capable of preparing and initiating the final revolutionary struggle, which is the essential aim of the party. Thirdly, it is counter-revolutionary insofar as it validates in the eyes of the proletariat ideologies, social groups, and parties which are extremely skeptical and impotent, defending the very democracy they claim allegiance to in the abstract, and whose only function and purpose, fully concomitant with those of the fascist movement, is to avert any costly independent march and the direct assault of the exploited masses on the economic and legal foundations of the bourgeois system. We're going to take this bit here. All right, so fascism will continue but rebranded as the bourgeois nations cannot maintain their existence while the varying social groups within vie for power, thus weakening the ability to respond to working class movement. The party must not fall for tricks which lead to the belief that the social groups outside the proletariat can be collaborated with to try to defeat fascism. And the entire point of fascism is to bring all these social groups under one order against the proletariat. The party must be prepared to face the highly developed bourgeois state, the alignment of all strata against the revolution, ruthless concentration of capitalism, and a police state to support all this. We need to come with the expectation that barefaced fascism will happen as soon as we try and defend ourselves. Kind of like, you're fighting a bully, or rather, you've let a bully beat on you for months and months and months, and then finally you stand up. Most of the time, the bully isn't going to appreciate that. They're going to get angry and hit you all the harder, and you need to be prepared for that. You need to be ready for when suddenly that mental thing switches in their head, and then suddenly it's just like, we're going to fuck you up. So you never even imagine fighting against us again. Continuing, our tactics must be aimed at the political independence of the working class to prepare for initiating and carrying out the final struggle. Back to the text. 5. The most important need in the present international situation is the getting together of an international political organization of all the local and national movements who have no doubt and no hesitation in placing themselves outside the blocks for bourgeois freedom and for the general anti-fascist struggle, who are outside all the influence of the bourgeois war propaganda on both sides of the front, who decide to rebuild the independence of thought, of organization, and of struggle for the international proletarian masses, who struggle for the unity of the proletariat and not the mixing together between groups of leaders that can only express disorderly and contradictory programs, but rather for the safe and organic overcoming of all the individual impulses aroused by the interests of distinct proletarian groups, separated by professional categories and by national affiliations, in a single force acting in common struggle towards world revolution. Okay, take this. Okay, so we need to rebuild the international, one that includes all local and national movements which reject alignment with bourgeois organizations, engage in general anti-fascist struggle, reject social chauvinism and are anti-war, aim for the unity of the proletariat, fight bourgeois ideology through propaganda, seek the organization of the international proletarian masses. This international needs to create a common program which rejects partial interests and instead creates general, safe, and organic force aiming for the common struggle for world revolution. Back to text. 6. The current Italian historical situation does not mean the closure of a period of bourgeois fascist government and the opening of a different period of bourgeois liberal politics, which returns to the cycle and relations of the period before 1922. It means the collapse of the apparatus of government and power of the ruling class in Italy, brought about not by an internal political crisis and differences of method, nor by decisive social and political attacks from outside, but by the military defeat and the victory of a group of states which the Italian bourgeois state waged war against. This situation doesn't present the conquest, even partially, of political power by proletarian or petite bourgeois strata. The reconstitution of the central apparatus of political control and police at the service of capitalist economic interests takes place by and under the strict direction of the great victorious states, in the form of a compromise accepted by the same national ruling class with the reduction of its privilege and sovereign autonomy of government in order to continue to exploit its own working classes by the bourgeoisie as a satellite state in the new world organization that resulted from the war. A system of counter-revolutionary forces is thus constituted, which is even more efficient than the fascist forces it replaced. 7. The Italian working class has no interest, either particular or general, either immediate or historical, in supporting the policy of the groups and parties which take advantage not of their own strength, but rather of the military ruin of the fascist government and which today exercise a pretense of holding power which the victorious states claim to be leaving to the Italian state machinery. The party, the expression of proletarian interests, must refuse not only collaboration in the government with these groups, but refusing all the doctrine, historical and political proclamations, which speak of national solidarity between classes, of a united struggle between the bourgeoisie and self-described proletarian parties on matters of freedom, democracy, and war against fascism and Nazism. The refusal of the party to engage in any political collaboration does not concern only the organs of the government, but also the committees of national liberation and any other similar body or combination of bodies, whether they have the same political basis or not. The National Liberation Committees historically and politically serve aims and purposes contrary to proletarian politics and interests. In fact, they can't even boast of overthrowing fascism. The actually effective elements of the clandestine action carried out against the fascist regime was the spontaneous and shapeless reaction of proletarian groups and of a few disinterested intellectuals, as well as the action and organization that every state and army creates and nourishes behind the enemy's back, and only to a small extent the influence of the political leaders, old drafted politicians, for new adventures at the disposal of any force that seems launched to success, who come out like gadflies immediately after the arrival of the winners for the sole purpose of getting themselves nice privileged positions in a new order. In reality, the network that the bourgeois or pseudo proletarian parties constituted in the clandestine period did not have as its aim the national and democratic partisan insurrection, but only the creation of an apparatus of a mobilization of any actually revolutionary movement that could have arisen after the collapse of the fascist and German defense. The fundamental impotence and lack of initiative of the Italian government remained the same, or rather worsened, in the liberation committees. Talks of transferring power to them are wholly illusory and defeat us from the proletarian point of view. It constitutes an exquisite example of that vainglorious maximalism, which, impotent and defeatist in action, has learned nothing from the tragic lesson imparted by the fascist victory. 8. The Revolutionary Proletarian Party must reject even the slightest co-responsibility in the policy of these groups, which have adopted the whole ideological propaganda approach to a victorious group of states, which have staged a foolish ploy, not of an acknowledged disarmament of the state and military apparatus to eradicate them forever, but rather shifting onto the field of bourgeois warfare which has not seriously damaged one of the groups, and that has neither benefit nor deceived the other. It must reject the political responsibility of the armistice signed by the old ruling classes of the country for the sole purpose of continuing their privileges and exploitation of the laboring classes. It must abandon them to their fate, to whatever treatment the victor will reserve for them, in a game of the forces of narrow social minority which will dictate and settle the peace. 9. The question of liquidating fascism makes no sense because fascism is the modern content of the bourgeois regime, and it can only be overcome historically and annihilated by the overthrow of capitalist class rule and its institutions, a task which cannot be accomplished by political coalitions which are as chimerical as they are impotent, and which have no intention of demolishing fascism, but rather by the revolutionary action of the proletariat. Consequently, the party discards and rejects all the weaponry of repression of fascism staged by the current government of Italy. The only serious struggle against fascism isn't based on tracking down and persecuting the militants, the squadristas, and hierarchs of the fascist period, a great number of whom already lurk in the present hierarchies anyway, with unchanged method and style, but in discovering and striking the class interests and social strata which carried out that mobilization, which are the same ones that are trying to retain control of the state today. Just as a side, I support, you know, going after and putting, the Nazis in prison and stuff. I support the content of the Nuremberg trials. I'm not going to say, no, we should not even bother with that. We only need to be focusing on what the hell are you even saying? Of course you go after the fucking militants. What is this person even on about? I don't understand. What is the possible harm? What is the possible trouble of saying, yeah, we need to continue the fight against fascism, and that involves the defeating, and that requires the defeating of capitalism entirely? But by the way, it's also a good thing that these hyper reactionaries who slaughtered all of our friends and stuff are kind of getting what's coming to them by their own class allies. In fact, it's quite ironic. Haha, look at these losers. There's nothing fucking wrong with that. This is. Gosh. Anyway. I understand what they're saying, but why are they saying it this way? It's so stupid. Okay. Anyway, these attacks can only be dealt by class-based forces, and when they'll come to the fore, all the most diverse organization hierarchies that today speak of eradicating fascism: church, monarchy, civil and military bureaucracy, strata of professional politicians and journalists, etc., will throw themselves squarely behind the counter-revolutionary side of the barricade. The politically reorganized proletariat thus reject the word of the day for purging the state apparatus, whose only interest is bourgeois conservation. The communists pursued a progressive disintegration of this apparatus, its demolition, and the burial of its remaining residue, in the sense of the Marxist phrase about capitalism creating its own ditchers. This hypocritical remedy of the purge must therefore be abandoned to the reactionaries. Okay. It must also. Okay, so. No. It must also be rejected and derided the policy of anti-fascist sanctions, which, in its juridical apparatus, opens January 3rd, 1925, accepting its historical one of the dates abused by Mussolini, and shows that fascism was welcomed and appreciated as long as it hit the revolutionary currents and the independent bodies of the extremist proletariat, and that should only be called criminal for the blows that was later able to dish out, with evident historical logic to its necessary accomplices in the first phase, leaders and political hierarchs of the rancid bourgeois parliamentarism. 10. The first task of the proletarian class party aimed at the historical goal of the conquest of political power in the most advanced countries of Europe and the world must be, on the basis of its sure orientation and doctrine program, the reconstitution of its organizational framework. In it, it will have to converge the intact forces of the old revolutionary militants who have not abandoned the proper line and tradition of the class, the more mature and decisive elements of the workers of the cities and the countryside who, because of recent hard times, feel the class antithesis with the bourgeoisie, who launched the reactionary counteroffensive and the gigantic political deception of the current anti-fascist masquerade, and feel an increasingly irremediable discomfort remaining under the influence of the falsely proletarian parties of today. And finally, avoiding the narrow laborist conception of the party which is rejected by Marxists, those class elements which are not purely proletarian, from whom, however, will be inexorably required to overcome any hesitation about the specific theoretical and political postulates of the movement. Okay. So the first task of proletarian class parties is to develop its organizational framework under the directions of its doctrine and program. This framework must include revolutionary militants, our true communists, the anti-fascist workers, the socialist workers who denounce the current worker organizations, and petit bourgeois and bourgeois elements who are sympathetic. Really, this would include like artisans as well, but any other group that's sympathetic to the communist cause. They will need to accept without hesitation the program, however. They don't get to have a say in that because of their class interests, not necessarily being aligned with the working class. Continuing. 11. The rules of party organization are coherent with the dialectical conception of its function. They do not rest on juridical and regulatory recipes and overcome the fetish of majority consultations. Their close connection with the upheld theoretical clarity and with the straightforward class tactics of political action must secure the party against harmful influence of inadequate cadres, degeneration into opportunist hierarchies similar to those of the parties of the Second and Third International in their phases of disintegration. Right? So the organizational structure does not rest upon judicial or regulatory or majority basis. It is instead based on class tactics of political action. These tactics must defend against inadequate cadres and opportunist hierarchies, which should realistically be one and the same thing, kind of. Anyway, continuing. 12. In the forefront of the party's political tasks is the work in the trade unions for its development and strengthening. The criterion, by now common to both fascist and democratic union politics, of attracting the workers' unions among state bodies under the various forms of its regulation with juridical framework must be fought against. The party aspires to reconstruction of the trade union confederation, fully independent from the direction of state offices, acting with the methods of class struggle and direct action against the bosses from local category claims to whole class interests. Workers belonging to different parties or to no party at all can join the workers' union. The communists neither proposed nor provoked the division of the unions due to the fact that their governing bodies are wholly in the hands of other parties. But they fully openly proclaimed that the purpose of the union is completed and integrated only with the political class party of the proletariat is at the head of the economic bodies. Any other influence on the proletariat's union organizations not only takes away from them their fundamental character of revolutionary organizations, demonstrated by all history of class struggle, but makes them sterile for the very purposes of immediate economic improvements by making them passive instruments in service to their interests of the bosses. I could go on for the next hour about American unions and how everything said here is exactly the case with American unions, with things like the Taft-Hartley Act, the AFL-CIO, and so on and so forth. This is exactly the result. So there's nothing on any revolutionary or even really reformist basis for unions in America. Continuing. The solution given in Italy to the formation of a central union was with a compromise not between three mass proletarian parties, as such a thing does not in fact exist, but between three groups of hierarchies of extra-proletarian cliques with pretensions to succession of the fascist regime, must be fought by inciting the workers to overthrow this opportunistic apparatus of professional counter-revolutionaries. The Italian trade union movement must return to its tradition of open and close support of the proletarian class party, leveraging on the vile resurgence of its local bodies, the glorious chambers of labor, which both in the great industrial centers and in the proletarian rural areas were protagonists of great openly political and revolutionary struggles. I'm going to take this. I'm not going to get the bottom part. We're just going to summarize this as the unions must be busted and placed with genuine proletarian economic organizations, which enter into direct conflict with their bosses. And are part of an industrial general union out. Continuing. 13. The party policy on the agrarian question, consistent with its Marxist approach, must aim at creating allies of the industrial proletariat in the countryside, not forgetting that for some time now in Italy, such allies have existed and are represented by those who directly work the land, temporary and wage laborers. The other groups of non-salaried land workers must be encouraged and urged to see the contradiction between their social interests with those of the urban and rural bourgeoisie. But this should not make the abolition of a supposedly surviving feudalism in certain regions of Italy a historical task, nor should it lead to an apology for the fragmentation of rural farms determined in certain areas by material and technical conditions, which cannot be but considered a counter-revolutionary element. The conquest of the land by the peasants is not a postulate that can be proposed and put into practice by a bourgeois, fascist, or liberal regime, nor is it the correct expression of the economic task of a proletarian regime in the countryside, which, while breaking up all land privileges of a strictly parasitic character that weigh on small farms, it will set its socio-economic measures and its policy on the track of removing, as quickly as possible, from the field worker the bourgeois character of ownership of the land and its products. This isn't something that pretty much anybody needs to worry about, unless you're like in India or something. Continuing. 14. The Proletarian Party denounces in the period of reconstruction of the productive forces that have been obliterated by the war in place of a need, even temporary, of collaboration between employers and workers. as such a thing will only ensure the prevalence of an exacerbation of class contrasts and a doubled exploitation of the wage earners in order to accumulate the wealth in the hands of the bosses and the state bureaucratic hierarchies that represent them. The economic policy of the state, taking up the developing the fascist social directives, will present as concessions to the working classes the formation of a state capitalism, the reaffirmed fortress of the dominant class and the bourgeois police, of which the senseless words of, quote, socialization of monopolies are but an accomplice disguise. Through this, the powerful organs of the industrial and banking monopolies will make the community, that is, their own employees, pay for the liabilities of the reconstruction of their plants and assets. The claims of the official, quote, communist, socialist, and Catholic parties for the socialization of the land, finance, and industrial monopolies all mean the complete opposite of the expropriation of profits in order to give them back and distribute them among the exploited, a claim which fuels a not insignificant portion of socialist-led struggles, because it means in a real practical sense is the socialization of the liabilities of the economy of the boss's economy, which has been exhausted by its military defeat, since its bankrupt debt will be paid by all the workers with a once again negative impact on their wages. The Proletarian Party stands firmly against all sayings from the bourgeois state, which has nothing in common with the claims of a socialist economy, which can only be implemented by revolutionary force, by fighting against the private mercantile and monetary economy on which all capitalist exploitation is based. 15. All the centrifugal forces which dissolve the centralism of the bourgeois state, such as separatist, autonomous, and regionalist tendencies, can facilitate its revolutionary overthrow. But the abstract concepts of decentralization and peripheral autonomy are not accepted by the Proletarian Party, which, first of all, notes that currently the state tends towards totalitarian concentration of not only national but international administrative management. Secondly, predicts that as far as the bourgeois sphere is concerned, the local organs would have an even worse weakness and parliamentary balances of those of the central organ, and would thus not result in any improvement, not even of a temporary character, for the treatment of the workers. Finally, it proclaims that the new and superior proletarian economy will be founded on rational plans of interweaving and unitary connection of all productive activities, addressed not to the monopoly bourgeoisie, nor to illusory government of compromise, but to the dictatorship of the proletariat, established through the third class offensive and protected from bureaucratic degeneration and privilege in its revolutionary worldwide outbreak. We'll take this. Okay, so separatist movements can create revolutionary conditions, but the party seeks maximal centralization. The local organs of struggle are not able to effectively fight against the hyper-organized bourgeois state. The party proclaims a new proletarian economy which is rationally planned, weaves together and unites all productive activities, and rejects governments of compromise such as bureaucracy and privilege. Back to the text. 16. The so-called institutional question, that is, of replacing the monarchy for the republic, does not represent in itself a contribution to new social solutions any more than it did in Repubblica Sociale Italiana. The revolutionary proletariat has an interest in nailing the Savoy dynasty to its historic responsibility in the bourgeois fascist counteroffensive, just as has an interest in denailing the same responsibility on all the social groups of the Italian privileged classes and all the hierarchies of the parties which today, in order to serve that ruling class, place themselves on the ground of collaboration and national unity. The revolutionary proletariat, when it will be able to break up the bourgeois state apparatus, will reserve the same fate to its conventional juridical summit, be it king or president. The reactionary and defeatist character of the dynasty in Italy, precisely because they are evident to all conscious proletarian groups, make inadequate any political bloc tactic that wants to create a fracture between the parties that intend to save the monarchy and those who demand its abolition. In fact, this line is not exactly definable today, and just as the military course of the war has caused the line between fascists and anti-fascists to fluctuate, so the decisions of the victorious states will cause a separation between monarchists and republicans to fluctuate among opportunistic Italian politicians in the most unforeseeable ways, between opponents of the monarchy on principle, the Savoy monarchy in particular, and those who will be reduced to the Byzantine choice between grandfather, father, and son. Proletarian party will warn the masses against a shrewd conservative policy of the Italian monarchical currents, which, continuing the interminable series of conversions between left and right, not only know how to present themselves as perfectly autonomous in the face of the inheritance of fascist frames, but also realistically opposed to the false democratic rhetoric, the antithesis between supposedly free and monarchic regimes like England and fascist and republican regimes like Germany. 17. Just as the substitution of the monarchy for the republic does not represent any step towards the burning Italian social question, neither can any convocation of an elective representatives assembly with constituent powers be accepted as such. First of all, this assembly will have a rather limited sphere of influence due to the permanence in the territory on which it should have full sovereignty. First of military occupational forces, and then of those armed forces that will be defined and arranged by the peace organization that will follow the current conflict and will be enforced in the satellite states. The future constitution of the Italian state will be dictated by the big winners and not by the consultation of the citizens. The electoral body will be established from the very beginning in the backstage of intrigue and political compromise. However, whatever the party's tactics may be, they will have to be inspired not only by its programmatic principles, but also on the open proclamation that in no case can the use of elective mechanisms allow the exploited classes to give adequate expression to their needs and interests, and even less give them political power. The party will differentiate itself from all other Italian parties at this moment, not only because it will not sell itself in the market of electoral combinations and aggregations, but also for the fundamental position that, while all others will proclaim that the political program to be implemented and accepted without further resistance will be whatever one happens to prevail, in terms of numerical majority, the Assembly, the Revolutionary Party rejects straight away this resignation and, in the abstract hypothesis, with practical certainty, that electoral victory confirms the constitutional survival of all basic capitalist institutions, even those a minority in the democratic sense. It will continue its struggle to bring them down from outside of its system. Only the historical struggle, the value of the relations of force, and not the authority of constitutional majorities will determine the extent of this struggle, which goes, according to the possibilities of class dynamics, from theoretical criticism to propaganda, which must always place a party in the opposition to the government, to the incessant anti establishment agitation to revolutionary insurrection. You know, just want to say this. He's talked a lot about defeatism, and I don't disagree with anything that they say in terms of the facts of the matter, right? But from the perspective of the vast majority of the working class that isn't going in and reading this and isn't saying, oh, they're boycotting the election on grounds that it doesn't get them what they want, right? The vast majority of people are going to look at this and call it defeatist, not the rejection of putting themselves in the parliament. You know, I'm suddenly reminded of that libertarian candidate who said, my first promise, if I'm elected to office, is to dissolve the government. Right? You can absolutely do that. You can go and say, hey, look, we know this won't fucking work. We're still putting ourselves here. Our goal is to dissolve the government, dissolve bourgeois private property, do such and such. We want to establish a dictatorship of the proletariat, which can only be done through revolutionary means. But we're still putting ourselves in the race, and you want to know why? Because on the off chance that we are elected, then we get to say, yeah, I told you so. There's no way we could do this way. So you might as well join with us for our actual organization, which is, to overthrow the bourgeois state and establish a dictatorship of the proletariat, right? Now, I think it's a very silly thing to do, but at the same time, I'm also like, from the perspective of somebody who's a liberal just like 3 years ago, 4 years ago, I would absolutely look at something like this and say, you're just being a defeatist asshole, right? So I kind of think that this kind of rhetoric is kind of hoisting them on their own poignard, right? I understand exactly where they're coming from. I don't necessarily disagree with it. But at the same time, I'm just saying that if they want to present this stuff for propaganda purposes, then they should maybe consider doing it in other ways. And yes, as Alpha Q says, there's also a thing to be said about participating in elections just to normalize the party and support for the party. There's other stuff to be said in previous readings we've done about electoralism and so on and so forth. The general consensus is rejection for more reasons than just this, which is kind of why I'm saying don't just make this the basis for your argument. Don't just make this the basis for your argument. Also include other things. If your argument is that we can't achieve victory through democracy, then it's like okay, but why not just do what that libertarian candidate is doing in order to develop consciousness and show that it can't be done, so that people actually go in there and do stuff, right? Because that would be my response. Why not just get whatever it is that you can get and then show and say, hey, we can't do anything more. Reform or revolution, am I right? But there's other reasons why you wouldn't go into electoral politics, which just doesn't actually engage in. And it's a weakness in this. But let's see. We're going to take this. Actually, continuing. Above all, the party will expose as counter-revolutionary any movement that claims to be useful to fake or for the sake of easier agitation and electoral successes, some kind of preliminary respect to the validity of the sovereignty of parliamentary consultation, claiming to be capable to pass from this ambivalent policy, whose multiple historical experiments have all resulted in the corruption and disarming of revolutionary energies to attack against the established regime. Okay, this right here does respond to the thing that I was putting forward, the potential argument. It's saying, hey, look, this is going to disarm revolutionary energies. Okay, that's fair. In the local elections, the party cannot abstain by prioritizing short-term interests from separating the responsibilities and approach of its proletarian forces from all others, and of continuing in full consistency with the continuity of its historical line, the agitation for its general historical aims. In more mature phases of the situation, which predictably cannot unfold except according to close inter-European connections, the party prepares itself in the masses for the constitution of the Soviets, representative organs of class character, which are at the same time organs of combat, for the destruction of all kinds of representative rights for the economically exploitative classes. Okay, we're going to put this in here. Okay, so the party must reject electoralism on the grounds that it must retain the correct line and not bow to majority principle within the bourgeois state. The bourgeois state is necessarily a minority anyway. The party is better suited to going to masses directly. Constitutional majorities will not bring about greater class struggle. The party must be able to practice what it preaches, and its propaganda and program must not be harmed by the influence of electoral activity. Agitation must be anti-establishment, aiming at revolutionary insurrection. And finally, in all reality, engagement in parliament has historically resulted in corruption, disarmament of revolutionary energy. So we just can't work under those conditions. Continuing, in the local elections, the party cannot abstain by prioritizing short-term interests from separating the responsibilities and approach of proletarian forces from all others, continuing in full consistency with the continuity of its historical line, the agitation for its historical general aims. In more mature phases of the situation, which predictably cannot unfold except according to close inter-European connections, the party prepares itself in the masses for the constitution of the Soviets, representative organs of a class character, which are at the same time organs of combat, for the destruction of all representative rights for the economically exploitative classes. I'm going to take this. All right, so the party seeks the production of worker councils. These worker councils are representative organs of the proletarian class. They are also organs of combat. They aim for the destruction of the representative rights for all the exploiters. Continuing. The party, in the construction of proletarian organs of all kinds, pre and post revolutionary, makes no distinction between workers based on gender. The question of granting the vote to women in the present representative regime is for a secondary question, since it cannot set itself apart from the critical ground that the exercise of the right to vote is a purely legal fiction in an environment in which economic inequality creates insufferable subjugation, including the subjugation of women, whose emancipation is conceivable only in an economy of a non-personal and non-family type. This, unfortunately, is still something that needs to be stated. I'm not going to summarize that, though. 18. The party rejects any appeal for national and war arming. It considers the Italian autonomous bourgeois state and its army as destroyed without appeal by defeat. Proletariat, saved from the bleeding to which it was led by the fascist policy of war, refuses further sacrifices invoked by privileged classes and its politicians for the sole purpose of procuring slavish merits. The proletarian party must oppose participation in wars near and far, calls for arms and conscription. With regard to the partisan and patriotic struggle against the German and the fascists, the party denounces the maneuver by which the international and national bourgeoisie, with the words it knows to be empty of substance, aims to restore official life to state militarism, comes to dissolve and liquidate these voluntary organizations, which in many countries were then attacked by armed repression. These movements, lacking sufficient political orientation, express for the most part the tendency of local proletarian groups to organize and arm themselves in order to conquer and maintain control of local situations, and therefore power. A tendency that was chained by a twofold illusion. The first, that the states at war with the Axis would ever keep their word regarding the promise-free regime, which the popular masses retained the right to not only the ballot paper, but to directly arm themselves. The second, that, after profiting in this sense from the technical aid of the official military organization, it was possible to force their hand and not hand back to supervening hierarchies and police the weapons of the dreamed liberation. In the face of these tendencies, which, even taking into account the propagandistic exaggerations that came along as convenience demanded, constitutes a historical fact, it is the task of the Revolutionary Party to clearly show the social and class postulates and the central requirement of the proletarian tactics that the most combative and resolute element, after a long blaze cycle of their offer to fight for other classes' cause, finally find a political saying and framework that allow them to fight only for their own cause, putting an end to the fearful strain in the service of more or less open class enemies. That kind of could be put in, but I don't think that's necessary. 19. The question of the territorial borders of the Italian state as they will be established after peace at the will of the victories, and the manifestation of neo-irredentism in the face of threatened removal of provinces from the eastern border, cannot create claims that deserve the support of the proletariat and its party. The stage when the ruling bourgeoisie will, for the first time, attempt internationalist accommodations for purely preservation purposes, the proletarian class will refuse even more rigorously than in 1914-15 to consider territorial accommodations on the basis of the nationality, ethnographic, linguistic principle as stages to be reached before laying the ultimate claim to internationalism in Europe and beyond. Just as the European Communist movement must disavow Italian irredentism, so on the other hand it must fight against Yugoslav irredentism, which is in the same way nothing but a propagandist superstructural expression of imperialist brigandage. Bleh. What a sentence. The Italian bourgeois dynasty and regime are well worthy of being passed over as the refuse of history. No less worthy are the dynasty and regime of the Yugoslav kingdom. If in Italy, the monarchy and the state made use of one of the most socially advanced regions of the country, arriving at the complete failure of the assumed unitary mission, in Yugoslavia, the regime even rested on the least advanced and most backwards parts, Serbia. If the Savoys grew through deception and political fraud, the Karađorđevics, I don't even know what that cross through D is. Never seen that before. Established themselves through political assassination. Both of these state militarisms aired democratic balderdash in their contemporary editions. The one and the other were among the most vicious and oppressive in the phase following the First World War, while the eventual republic led by Tito is no better or worse than the possible conservative bourgeois republic of Italy. The Italian revolutionary proletarians will collaborate on this problem not with their own bourgeoisie, but with their fellow Serbian, Croatian, and Slovenian comrades for the overthrow of all nationalism for international revolutionary action. I'll take this little bit. This is actually interesting and of potential use. And we're going to add this to the dictatorship of the proletariat as well. Continuing. 20. The Proletarian Communist Party cannot make the colossal mistake of considering the powerful organization of the church as neutral in class conflicts, nor allow itself to be led to this by the historical fact that the church itself, the social and political fulcrum of the pre-bourgeois regimes, has today passed into total solidarity with the capitalist institutions which succeeded the democratic revolution. Indeed, precisely for this reason, the church must be considered as a factor of the first order in the preservation of capitalist institutions. All the more so when, as in Italy, it is reconciled with the state and aspires parties that have laid down their anti-democratic and anti-social approach and corresponded with the parallel renunciation of the bourgeois party's Masonic anti-clericalism. The class proletarian party, in the face of the unreserved collaboration between Catholics and the Democratic left, certainly does not proclaim a return to the bourgeois anti-clericalism of the Masonic type, fiercely opposed by its best traditions, and does not oppose religion by an atheism of the old bourgeois type, inspired by the anti-Marxist formula, according to which it is necessary first to free consciousness from religious dogma, or to have the right to want to free the lower classes from social exploitation. The party, however, in its propaganda, emphasizes the fundamental antithesis between its theory of the world and history and any transcendent mystical religious conceptions, and declares incompatible with belonging to revolutionary ranks of that religious association of any school. The proletarian regime after the revolution will programmatically exclude any religious association, believing that it cannot but present political characteristics, and will endeavor to progressively make every religious belief disappear, as the masses, freed from the extremes of economic depression, will be led more and more towards scientific knowledge into the materialist conception of particular party doctrine. I'm also going to add this to the dictatorship of the proletariat, but also to this. The same campaign of political and theoretical clarification must aim at the criticism, together with the religious conceptions of those of an immanentist nature, that is to say, which sustain as the guidelines of human activity immaterial forces and values placed in the sphere of a purely ideal activity, which today cover the vapid, empty talk of the supreme values of personality and human dignity. As a coefficient of theoretical degeneration, these conceptions can be even more dangerous than the transcendental ones, which, by admitting an incomprehensible world of the beyond, prevent the concrete knowledge of real relations, so that any atheism falling back into bourgeois enlightenment type incredulity should not be considered as a step towards the doctrine of communism. 21. The proletarian party, in Italy as in the whole world, must distinguish itself from the mass of all other political movements and, more importantly, pseudo-political parties of today, in its fundamental historical structuring for the original evaluation of the antithesis between fascism and democracy as types of organization of the modern world. The communist movement, at its origin, about 100 years ago, had to and could in order to accelerate any movement against the existing social conditions, admit the alliance with the Democratic parties, because they then had a revolutionary historical task. Today, this task has been long since over, and those same parties have a counter revolutionary function. Communism, despite the defeats of the proletariat in decisive battles, has nevertheless taken gigantic steps forward as a movement. Its defining feature today is to have historically broken down and denounced. Ever since capitalism became imperialistic, ever since the First World War revealed the anti-revolutionary function of Democrats and Social Democrats, every policy of parallel action, even transitory with democracies. In a situation succeeding this crisis, communism will either withdraw from history, swallowed up into quicksands of gradualist democracy, or will act and fight alone. In its political tactics, the Revolutionary Proletarian Party in Italy as the whole world will rise again only insofar as it will distinguish itself from all the others and above all from false communist parties that refer back to the Moscow regime of today as it has pitilessly revealed the extent of the defeatism of all the supposed moves of penetration and circumvention presented as a transitory adhesion to common objectives of other parties and movements, and justified by promising, in secret or in the inner circle of adherents, that such maneuver serves only to weaken and beguile the adversary in order to break the agreement and alliances with them at certain moment, passing to the class offensive. Such a method has proved likely to lead to the disintegration of the Revolutionary Party, to the inability of the working class to fight for its own ends, to the dissipation of its best energies in securing results and movements and achievements that benefit only its enemies. As in the manifesto of a century ago, the communists disdain to conceal their principles and their aims, and openly declare that their end can only be achieved by the violent fall of all social orders that have existed up to now. In the framework of contemporary world history, if by chance a residual function were to be up to democratic bourgeois groups for the partial and eventual survival of the demands for national liberation, for the liquidation of backward islets of feudalism and similar relics of history, such a task would be carried out in a more decisive and conclusive way, in order to give rise to the further cycle of bourgeois crisis, not by a passive and abdicating arrangement of the communist movement to those postulates, which are not its own, but by virtue of an implacable lashing out of the communist proletarians against the incurable sluggishness and laziness of leftist paid bourgeois groups and bourgeois parties. So I wanted to go up real quick and grab this. And then we're also going to grab this. Oopsies. Okay, sorry, continuing. With reference to these directives, which have complete validity throughout the world, a communist movement in Italy must mean, in the fearful situation of dissolution of all social frameworks and all doctrinal and practical orientations of classes and parties, a violent call for ruthless clarification of the situation. Fascists and anti-fascists, monarchists and republicans, liberals and socialists, Democrats and Catholics, who get increasingly sterilized in debates of any theoretical meaning, and despicable rivalries and repugnant maneuvers, should receive a ruthless challenge, which would force everyone to denude the real positions of national and foreign class interests, which in fact they reflect, and to carry out, if by any chance they had any, their historical task. If in the disintegration and fragmentation of all collective and group interests, a new crystallization of openly militant political forces is still possible in Italy, the resurgence of the Revolutionary Proletarian Party will be able to determine the new situation. When this movement, which will be the only one to proclaim its final class aims, its party totalitarianism, the size of the limits which separate from the others, will have set its political compass in the direction of the revolutionary North. All the others will be challenged to confess their real direction. No, they won't. Yeah, the Democrats still won't. They still will not disagree when the Republicans call them socialists, right? They won't let you talk. Anyway, The political bow will be able to free itself from the influence of rhetorical and demagogic masquerades, freed from disinfection of politicians' business professionalism, which affected in its history the Italian ruling class. No, it won't. If this pathological dissolution was denounced as acute during the fascist period, today the proletarian masses note more and more every day that no one has stopped or reversed this process, and it continues inexorably despite the vaunted prophylaxis of the charlatans of democracy, and feel it will be closed only by the radical surgery of the revolution. Okay, and that is the text, the 1945 Party Platform. Thank you for joining this reading by the United Marxist Pact. I hope everybody who isn't there enjoyed it and will consider joining the server if you aren't already part of it. The link will be below. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.